we got a little bit of a different segment for you today. We're going to read some research papers. Why? I don't know. I was reading some research papers and I was like, I could record this and share maybe some best practices on how to read a research paper. It can be a little difficult. A lot of it has to do with the way it's written and the words that they use. There are some huge words in research papers, especially medical papers, stuff that I don't understand. And so I think that keeps a lot of people from reading research papers because they're like, what am I even reading? This is not a human sentence. And I want you to know that I feel the same way, even though I went to school for biology and somehow made it through quite a bit of that. Didn't do super well in biology. That's not my career anymore, but I did learn how to read research papers. And a big part of learning how to read research papers is learning how to Google words that you don't understand. And even that is kind of difficult. So you really have to segment it down to just Googling specific parts of words like this prefix or this suffix or what does this thing mean? And so I thought maybe that was something I could share. Plus, reading research papers is fun. You learn interesting things. It's really great if you're in an argument. You can just throw out some research at people. People are flabbergasted when you hit them with current research and then you can cite your source. People have no response. To be honest, sometimes it infuriates them because they're like, how do I even, we were having an argument and just sharing opinions and then now you're hitting me with facts. So I don't know, use with caution. Anyway, I was just going to show you some best practices for reading a research paper. We're not going to get too far into it today. We're really just going to talk about reading an abstract. What is an abstract? Well, before we get there, where do we find research? There's a couple places that I really like to find research. One of them is Google Scholar. You literally just Google Scholar, and Google Scholar is a search engine to help you find access to articles and places where research is published. There's a few other places. One of my favorite is PubMed. I'm sure everybody has heard of PubMed, or if you haven't, it probably sounds like something where it's like, yes, PubMed, a publication for medical journals. Super easy, right? So that's what we're on right now is PubMed. PubMed, again, is a database for all these other journals that publish research. So you'll find access to lots of research, and usually it has an abstract, which again, I'm about to explain. And a lot of times the research is free, but sometimes to get to the full article, there's a paywall, and that sucks, right? We don't like that. If research is really prominent, like if it's groundbreaking, if it's a big deal, a lot of times they'll get like a grant for it to be made public domain, and then you can access it for free. But I don't know, if you get into reading research, some of these, subscriptions to these different articles are like pennies on the dollar. They're so cheap and there's so much information available to you and it's a lot of fun. But we're going to start with PubMed and we're, again, really just going to talk about how to read an abstract. So you can see I'm on PubMed right here. And I just Googled, or I didn't Google, but I searched jumping. I was like, let's find some research articles on jumping. So this one's pretty recent. It's from a strength and conditioning research organization. I don't know. It's from June 2022, so pretty recent. And we like recent research for a few reasons. First of all, saying recent research, great word. It's an alliteration. I'm a big fan of alliterations, recent research. Also, we like recent research because recent research, it's applicable because, the factors that we live with in our current day and age, for the most part, probably apply. There's research from like 1842. That's probably not going to apply if it, pertains to like drinking water from the ground or something like that. Maybe it still does. I don't know. It depends on where you live. But anyway, so we want it recent because it's probably similar to our conditions that we live in right now. We also want it recent because it's more likely to be higher quality research. And that could be a whole separate video. But, you want high quality research because it's reliable, because it is most often involves statistics, and there's a whole segment we can talk about that if something is statistically significant. If that gets into this, I will explain it. But for the most part, what you want to know is that there is math you can use to be like, okay, the result that we got from this is very likely to be something that is real and not just like a chance. It just happened to happen this way. We know random things happen, and so sometimes research is not very reliable if it's not using statistics to make it statistically significant, to measure its significance. So you want statistics involved in your research, if only just to be like, okay, the probability that this result that we just measured is random is so low. Like, it's not statistically significant that this was random. It's probably something that actually happened, as a result to, whatever parts of the research or this experiment that we controlled. We, changed this. It's statistically significant that we changed that. It's probably not a random chance. So that's another reason why we want recent research. We also like recent research because it's usually clinical, meaning it's in a proper setting. There's not outside factors influencing it. We want it to be double blind. I can explain more of this also, but double blind, in short, means that the participants of the research don't know what part of the research they're in. So, for example, if it's a medication or a supplement, the participants don't know if they are receiving the whatever it is that we're experimenting, or if they aren't, if they're getting a control or getting a placebo. So you want that. And then double blind. So the people who are running the research, they don't know which one is which either. So their own bias implicitly can't affect how they interpret the results, right? And then I just mentioned a control. That's another reason we want recent research. A control means we have two groups. A lot of times they're called cohorts. And you've got the control group, the control cohort, which is identical to the research group. The research group is receiving whatever the factor is that we're measuring. It could be a medication. It could be a new way of trying something. We're testing this, whatever it is. That's the one where the results should be happening. And then we've got the control group, which is identical, but is not receiving any of those things. They're getting a placebo, right? And so you want to control, because then we have something to measure the research against. There's all these reasons why we want recent research. So the fact that this was published in 2022 is a really good sign. Obviously, you can get stuff from, the last 20 years or further. And then we just have to pay a little closer attention to the methods and methodologies. That's probably a different video because we're just talking about the abstract. That's like getting into the actual way they ran the study. So we'll talk about that in the future. But let's just talk about this one in particular. Assisted jumping in healthy older adults, optimizing high velocity training prescription. We got all these people that were part of it. If you're in the research world, that probably means something. I'm not in the research world enough to know who these people are or to have an opinion about that. But here's the abstract. First of all, this is the link to the study right here. So if you wanted to dive into it, you would click that. Here's the abstract. So reading an abstract, here's what an abstract is. An abstract is essentially a summary of the paper. It needs to be its own original work, right? So it's not an excerpt of the paper. It can't just be like, here's the introduction, copy and paste. It has to be almost like, a report. It's almost like somebody watched a movie and then gave you a full plot review, a full summary, with a rating as well. That's kind of what an abstract is. It needs to be its own complete work. It summarizes things. You can learn a lot from abstracts, but also the abstract is not a replacement for the research paper because, for example, the abstract, for the most part, doesn't show all the details of how they structured a study. And so you can miss some really important details. You could be really interested in a certain result, and then you get into the methodology and you're like, oh, they measured this in a way that doesn't even apply. For example, an abstract might not mention that, I don't know, a certain medication was used only on women, and it could just be talking about people, and maybe you're a man, and for whatever reason, this certain medication is really important to you, and the fact that you're a man and your experience and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Maybe this is a bad example, but the abstract should include who it was that was part of the methodology, but it might not, right? It might not be that detailed, and so that's just probably a bad example, but you really want to look at the actual research itself. The abstract is really good at helping you understand what the study was, what they were trying to find out, why, and if there were results. And so if there were results, that's when you're like, oh, I want to read about this. Okay. So here we go. The abstract, we've got all these names. So we get here, assisted jumping in healthy older adults. And of course, I just looked up jumping. I'm already in, right? We talked about in a previous video, jumping as an example of something that everybody can do. It's an innate, not everybody can do. Most people under the normal circumstances should be able to do that. It's an innate human ability, animal ability, whatever. But at some point we just stopped doing it. And so I kind of went on a tangent about that. So I was like, well, let's look at some research on jumping. Why not? Voila. We got recent research on jumping. I should have known. Because older adults benefit from power training. Training strategies for adults such as supramaximal velocity assisted jumping could also be useful for older adults. Okay, so first sentence, we're like, whoa, what are we even talking about? I have to read this sentence twice. That's fine. That's how research works. They try to pack the maximum amount of information into one sentence. So let's break this down. Because older adults benefit from power training. Well, what's power training? Power has a definition for physics, I'm sure, but in the sense of sport training, I know what it is, but let's look it up. I'm going to Google power definition sports. Power is defined by how quickly an athlete can generate their maximum strength. High power outputs can, I think it's trying to say, be trained and developed by training at mid-velocity and force levels. Okay, so that should answer it pretty well for us. That power is our ability to produce the most amount of our strength that we have available as quickly as possible. So a good example would be like strength in isolation. Sometimes it takes time to reach your maximum amount of strength. Think about opening a jar, and the jar is stuck really hard, and you can't just pop it open. So it takes several seconds of you like cranking on this jar to create enough force that you're putting into the lid of the jar to actually open it, right? It's not immediate. And somebody who's really strong might be able to theoretically get to their maximum amount of strength like immediately, but sometimes it takes time. Or if you think of like a 1 rep max on a leg press, the weight is slowly coming down, and then you are pushing it, and it's not like it just you complete the rep immediately if it's truly a 1 rep max. Or, who's doing a 1 rep max? But if it's a really heavy weight, it takes time. You have to push and push and push, and you are neurologically sending messages from your brain to your muscles to recruit more muscle fibers to complete this action. That's strength. Power, in this example, is jumping. You don't have a lot of time to exert power into the ground, or to exert force into the ground as you're jumping. You have an instant to exert as much force as you can to jump, right? So a strength athlete, theoretically, could jump. They could create a lot of force through their legs, but they might not have a lot of power. They might not be able to create a lot of power and strength into the ground to jump in the quick enough amount of time it takes to actually jump high, right? Versus somebody who's light and maybe doesn't have that strong of a leg press or a squat, whatever you want to measure it with, but they have a lot of power. They neurologically are able to access a higher amount of their strength in an instant to jump off the ground. They have a higher amount of power ability, right? So reading this again, because older adults benefit from power training power, not just strength, but their ability to use it as quickly as possible. Training strategies for athletes such as supramaximal, here we go, velocity assisted jumping. So what is supramaximal, right? If you want to look up that term, obviously we would just look up supra definition, and we'll say medical, right? But you could also say research. Prefix meaning above, beyond, or on the top side. Well, that's easy. So supramaximal, so above our maximum, and then we have velocity assisted jumping. Well, what's velocity? Another one we can look up. Velocity, I know it to be speed with a direction. Here we go. The speed of something in a given direction. So it's not just speed, in any different, speed like in a vacuum, speed in any given direction. Velocity is we are focusing our speed a particular way, right? So again, training strategies for athletes such as supramaximal, above maximum, velocity assisted jumping. So it is assisting our speed and direction of jumping. Could also be useful for older adults. However, optimizing assisted exercise prescription in older adults remains uninvestigated. I love this phrasing, whoever wrote this. Love the words they're using. So this is saying, however, optimizing assisted exercise. So what's an assisted exercise? It's the difference of doing a pull-up versus if you've been to the gym and you see the pull-up assist machine where there's the lever, right, with a flat spot that you can put your knees on, and you can change the amount of assistance to help you do more pull-ups. So, however, optimizing assisted exercise prescription. So we're not optimizing the exercise, we're optimizing what exercises or assisted exercise we prescribe for older adults remains uninvestigated. So they haven't looked into what is best to help them train their power. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to determine the effects of different body weight assistant levels on jumping force and velocity in healthy adults. So in a word that they're going to say a whole bunch of times, they will abbreviate. So BW, we see that means body weight. So the purpose of this study was to determine the effects of different body weight and then also assistance levels. So you got different body weights of individuals, and then the amount of assistance that they received on jumping force and velocity in healthy older adults. 23 healthy older adults. So again, this goes back to the example I said before. This just says older adults. This doesn't say men or women. Now, in general, jumping, I don't think is applicable. That probably doesn't change too much between a man or a woman. Like maybe their overall height, but somebody who's a man or a woman interested in the effects of jumping for themselves probably doesn't matter, right? Because the research is the research versus like, how maybe a certain medication would interact. That, you might want to look into the methodology. Just a note on that. 23 healthy older adults. So now we have their stats, and this is important. So the average age, this is what this first number is, 67.6. So on average, they were 67.6 years old. This plus or minus that you see right here is the standard deviation. So plus or minus 7.6 years. So what that's telling you is when you think of a curve, right, the average is the middle, 67.6 plus or minus 7.6 years on either side. That would be one standard deviation. Well, what does that mean? That tells you that it's not plus or minus 20 years, right? So it's not like we have the average age of 67, but then there are people that were in their 40s doing this, right? This is all people that are roughly within their 60s, exactly within their 60s or getting into early 70s. That's what the standard deviation is telling you. In general, for research like this, a more narrow standard deviation is nice if you're in that age group because you're like, okay, this information is like really focused on this age group. If you were just interested in people over 50 and how their jumping was for this research, you might want a larger standard deviation because there were more participants throughout that whole age range. So some people think that you just want a narrow standard deviation. Not necessarily. You might want the research to be narrow if you're looking for a specific result in a specific area. You might want it to be broad, right? Because you might be like, well, how applicable is this across the age range, right? That's just one example. So also the average weight, 167 pounds plus or minus one standard deviation of, this is their height. So 167 centimeters in height plus or minus 8.8 centimeters, right? So we could look up that conversion, but I don't think that's super interesting here. And then this is their weight, 72.7 kilograms plus or minus 14. So kilograms to pounds, I think, is 2.2 pounds to kilograms. So yeah, these people are pretty lean. They're like under 200 pounds for sure. Let's see. And then we have a 27.1 body fat percentage, plus or minus 6.9%. So these people are not lean, let's put it that way, right? If you're lean, you're probably under 15% body fat. Well, okay, so this is kind of convoluting the study because this is probably men and women. And what's the average body fat percentage for women? Probably in the 20s, right? The average body fat percentage for men, lower. So that I would say pay less attention to that, right? The body fat, it's just not a huge number. Really here, okay, this is a great example of a standard deviation being important. The standard deviation is 6.9% body fat. What that tells us is for the most part, people were a similar body fat percentage. It wasn't a huge range. So that's not going to confound the results. It wasn't like there was plus or minus 30% body fat. Some people were like massively more, had a lot more body fat than other people, or like massively less. Like there wasn't hyper athletes in this study, So this is a good example of where your standard deviation, you kind of want it to be more narrow because you're like, okay, these research, the numbers we're about to see is consistent as opposed to, well, was it just for a few people that threw off the numbers? Okay, they performed 5 individual counter movement jumps at body weight at BW. 90, 80, 70, and 60% of body weight. So that to me says they used, some sort of assistance, probably like some, resistance bands or something like that, that was removing some of their body weight from when they were jumping, right? So at body weight, at 90% of body weight, so that was basically 10% help. 80% of body weight, 20% help, you guys get it, right? 60%, I could jump over a building if I only had to jump and feel 60% of my body weight fighting against me as I was jumping. Jumps were performed on a force plate, which provided peak takeoff force, TOF, flight time, and peak force impact. A linear position transducer. Measured peak concentric velocity. So we could look up what a transducer is. I don't care, right? I'm not super suspicious of these methodologies. I'm more interested in the research itself. If I was like, how did they measure this? Then maybe I would want to look up what a linear position transducer. Linear position. It was in one spot and there was one variable. It was linear, right? So I'm assuming that meant like we just measured, the exact amount of force that when they jumped. They weren't measuring like the force and then also a direction, which we don't care about direction in this one. This is, how we can assist their training to make them jump better. Not, who jumped the furthest in a certain direction, right? Because then you would want peak force and a direction. We're not worried about that. We've just got one linear, number that we're worried about. The rating of perceived exertion. I actually love this. This is really important in modern day training. Like if you're working out, RPE is a big deal because it'll keep you honest, right? Because your RPE can change. Some days you just feel like you can jump high, and other days you feel like you can't because you drank more water or slept more or, listened to a really good song and you were like, dang, Sweater Song from Weezer is a great song. I want to jump. Was also assessed after each condition. Takeoff force was greater during body weight than all other conditions. Let's see. Well, yeah, no wonder takeoff force was greater because body weight theoretically would be the heaviest version of the jump, right? They were receiving no assistance. It was their own body weight. They had to produce the greatest amount of force to take off. So that makes sense. Let's see. 90 and 80% were greater than 70% and 60%. That makes sense, right? Because they were only receiving a little bit of help with 90% and 80%, so they would have greater takeoff force. But there were no differences between 80 and 90% or 70 and 60%. That's very interesting. But there were no differences between 80 and 90 or between 70 and 60. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So the category of 80 and 90% had greater takeoff force than the category or the grouping of 70, 60%. But there was no difference between 80 and 90% individually or between 70 and 60. So that means, I don't know. I would assume that means that it's hard for us to tell the difference between small amounts of help, right? You're just going to push off really hard with 80% versus 90%, probably using the same amount of force. Same with 70 and 60%. But apparently we could notice a difference between something like 60% and 80%. There was enough of a difference there that it took less force perceived in your mind to get off the ground with 60%. The FT, the flight time, progressively increased at all assistance levels. Well, that makes sense, right? The more help you got with jumping, the higher you were able to jump. They didn't measure how high you could jump. They measured how long you stayed in the air. We're not floating. We're not levitating. So we know that if you jumped higher, you stayed in the air longer. So higher flight time. And PV, what was PV? Peak velocity? Yeah, peak velocity. So how fast you were able to get off the ground, how fast you were able to jump. Peak velocity was faster for all assistance levels than body weight. Of course, because you probably had to use less of your velocity. You were less trained. So we just talked about training power. Some people can access a lot of their strength, so they have high power. Some people can't access that much of it very quickly, so they have low power. If you lower the demand, then of course that means more people are able to access more of their strength because they're maybe not trained, but they don't need to be, right? So that's why it's saying peak velocity was faster for all assistance levels than body weight, with no differences between assistance levels. Interesting. So at some point, everybody has a base amount of power that's available to them. And then as it gets heavier, that's when you start having less and less people that are strong enough or have enough power to actually execute the move quickly, right? But at some base level, this is what it's telling us. We all pretty much can, have access to a certain amount of power to make that peak velocity happen. Impact force was greater during body weight than 80, 70, and 60, of course, right? Impact force, so how hard they hit the ground. Well, impact force, they had the most weight, right? They weren't getting any assistance. And was greater during 90 than 60%. Of course, they're getting only a little bit of help with 90% versus 60%. 40% of their weight is not even hitting the ground because there's assistance. The RPE was less than body weight during all assistance conditions, but was the least during 70%. So that's interesting. So the rate of perceived exertion was less during body weight I'm sorry, was less than body weight during all assistance conditions. So any amount of assistance they were receiving, they perceived less exertion. They were like, it felt easier to jump, which of course they were getting help. So of course it felt easier to jump. But here's the most interesting part of this whole thing, right? It was the least during 70%, right? So they felt like it was the easiest, it was the least exertion to jump during 70%, even though we measured 60%. So that could mean that 60%, they felt like it was either the same as 70 or slightly more. And you know what that means? That 70%, as far as for training, is probably the most efficient amount of assistance to give somebody if they're going to train, because they were still feeling 70% of their body weight, if I'm doing that math right. Right? 90% assistance levels. I'm assuming that's what it was. Yeah, during 70% of their body weight. So they were still feeling the majority of their body weight as they were jumping, but it felt like it was the easiest. So of course, they're going to say what I just said. Implementing assisted jumping between 70 and 80% of body weight in older adults likely provides the ideal combination of force, velocity, and RPE. So they're saying if you're going to train somebody, specifically an older adult, on their power, their ability to exert force with jumping, right, which is a great one. We talked about this. The ideal one is implementing assisted jumping, so some sort of apparatus, a jumping apparatus, whatever it is, maybe it's resistance bands, that allows you to still feel 70 to 80% of your body weight when you're jumping. So it's still meaningful. It's still a hard jump. You know, it's not like it's not like you're on a trampoline. But it provides the ideal combination of force. So you're still using quite a bit of force, right? Velocity, you are still generating that speed in a direction. It's not like you're just bouncing with the rigidity of the, whatever the assistance machine is that you're using. And then RPE, it's the lowest rate of perceived exertion. So it is the least tiring for you for an exercise. We don't always want RPE to be low, and there's a whole separate video we could do about that. You need to exert, but that's mental. This is saying for the sake of keeping older adults jumping, and training them to be able to use more power clearly into their 70s, we don't want the RPE to be high because we want them to be able to do it consistently and train themselves. We want them to be able to get the maximum benefit for their body with the least wear and tear and the least strain, the least perceived exertion, so that way they actually get it done. They're not exhausted. They can recover, and then they can maintain their mobility and their power production in their everyday life, which, what does that translate to? Staying young, power production, key for going on running, or going on walks. I was going to say running, rock climbing, I don't know, not falling when you're going up and down stairs, anything, right? Just staying young, staying mobile, not getting hurt. We know that power production is directly related to balance and coordination and all this stuff in your, actually it's not your prefrontal cortex. I think it's the back of your brain. I don't remember. I have to look that up. Anyway, I don't even know how long this video is because I don't have a timer for it. But I just wanted to jump into some research about jumping, pun not intended, but excellent. And then sort of break down how you can read even just an abstract. You can learn so much. If people would just look up research papers and read an abstract, I don't know, the wealth of knowledge out there is amazing. I'm not saying that all research papers are true or that, everything is explained by science, or I'm not saying anything. I'm literally just like, here's PubMed, try it out. Here's how to read an abstract article. I am saying that you should arm yourself with knowledge, and by the way, you should look into the methodology of how they perform a study, because some information can be skewed. A lot of information can be skewed. It can also be used in ways that it was not meant to be used. It can be used to support arguments that are not related to it. So you should arm yourself with the ability to read a research paper, look at the way they did a study, and be like, this is stinky because there's these flaws in the way they set up the study, or the way you use this fact is stinky because it's not even supporting what you said. Or who knows, you could find out something super cool. And, science rocks, but science isn't everything. You have to carefully interrogate and interpret it. I'm going on a tangent. I don't even know. Read some research. Stay jumping.